Alright, part 2 of the energy systems. We left off in the last video with talking about the ATP-PC system, any activity lasting up to 10 seconds, high intensity. Remember, we also have the ATP system, which is just 1 to 4 seconds. And that the important thing to remember about ATP is that we call upon this for any activity we do for the first 10 seconds, no matter what we're doing. Alright? So, moving on to the next one is called, the other second energy system we're going to talk about is anaerobic glycolysis, also sometimes referred to as the lactic acid system. Now I'm going to give you a very basic overview of anaerobic glycolysis because you're going to learn about this in much more detail and the whole lactic acid part of it when you get to your cardiovascular training for performance class. So I'll touch on it, but I'm not going to go into as much detail as you might actually see if you read more about it, because I don't want to confuse you too much. But so this is anaerobic glycolysis. This is kind of like our muscle fibers we were talking about, the type 2A muscle fibers. The anaerobic glycolysis is the same thing, kind of that jack of all trades, master of none system. We call upon it for various different exercises in between super high intensity and really slow long duration. And what it uses for energy, or to create ATP, is muscle glycogen. So if you remember back, I told you that muscle glycogen is the stored form of the carbohydrates that we eat. So it uses muscle glycogen, blood glucose, meaning available glucose in the blood, liver glycogen, and liver glycogen as substrates. No fat though, or protein. Anaerobic glycolysis only relies upon muscle glycogen, all right, to provide to produce ATP. So remember, in the ATP-PC system, what we needed was that creatine molecule to provide, or the breaking off of that creatine molecule from the phosphate molecule to allow the formation of ATP. So it has a high rate of ATP energy production, and it's the primary fuel in sprint type activities, a few seconds to a few minutes. So lactic acid system, basically one of the byproducts of this system is lactic acid. Now, lactic acid gets a bad name. It's not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, lactic acid can actually be re-shuttled into the aerobic system to be used for energy. So, we have this thing that we say that lactic acid makes us sore. It's not necessarily the lactic acid that makes us sore. It's the lactic acid that causes a formation of hydrogen ions that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But when you say lactic acid is what makes you sore, it's not actually physiologically correct to say that. But we're not going to worry about that right now, because we just don't want to let lactic acid have a bad name. It's actually something good, and the better shape you're in, especially as you're increasing your anaerobic threshold, which probably means nothing to you yet, your body learns to reshuttle this lactic acid back for fuel. So lactic acid can actually be a friend, not just a foe. So body uses stored glycogen to remake ATP, like we talked about. We need some oxygen to do this properly. So we have about 2 to 3 hours of glycogen stored in the body, and happens because of hold on, I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm going to go forward. Sorry, didn't want to say that. As a matter of fact, forget what I said about the oxygen to do that properly. I think I don't even know why that's there. I know why it's there, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about the lactic acid system being an anaerobic system. But it's just like those other muscle fiber types. It can have oxidative. It can enter into the oxidative system at a certain point. But that we're not going to go into that much detail yet. So, lactic acid system, or anaerobic glycolysis, it is anaerobic, means it does not need oxygen to produce ATP. It requires more chemical reactions than the ATP-PC system. That's why it's not the first system used like the ATP-PC system. It takes a little bit more time. So like I was telling you in the last video, the ATP-PC system is always recruited at the onset of exercise because it takes a little bit for the other systems to engage. It is activated at the beginning of intense exercise, all right? But peak power from this system is reached between 5 to 15 seconds. It continues to provide ATP, though, until it fatigues at about 2 to 3 minutes. So although we talk about the ATP-PC system being 0 to 10 seconds, it's really 10 seconds to 3 minutes where we're really seeing the lactic acid involvement. So some example of activities: 400-meter hurdles, 50-meter butterfly, 200-meter world record, stuff like this. These are just some examples of activities that you might see. So how does it work? ATP must be reformed from ADP and pi. We know that now. The energy must come from breaking down that stored glycogen. Breaking down glycogen is called glycolysis, hence anaerobic glycolysis. The lactic acid system does this without oxygen and is therefore referred to as anaerobic glycolysis. Because there's no O2 or oxygen present, the glycogen is not totally broken down and the byproduct, lactic acid, is formed. You don't need to worry about that right now. You're not going to get asked about that right now. But I put it there just to understand that lactic acid is a byproduct, and depending on the length of the exercise, this energy system can flow right into the aerobic system. So, this system is really important when the activity is longer than a few seconds and your creatine phosphate has been depleted, and the activity is too intense for aerobic metabolism. Once again, jack of all trades, master of none. I'm not going to worry about any of that. Alright, and then our last energy system we're going to talk about, probably the one you're most familiar with, is the oxygen energy system, or oxidative glycolysis. So we have anaerobic glycolysis, and then we have aerobic glycolysis. So aerobic system, it uses, like the lactic acid system or anaerobic glycolysis, it uses glycogen to remake ATP. Are you starting to understand why carbohydrates are so important? If we don't have that glycogen, we aren't going to be able to last. Used in longer submaximal activities, long runs, swims, cycles. Plenty of oxygen available to remake ATP, so no lactic acid is accumulated. The lactic acid is accumulated because there is no oxygen available. So the oxygen supply meets the demand of the activity. Okay? We will keep supplying ATP for as long as our fitness levels allow. So as long as we have plenty of stored glycogen, and as long as we have plenty of ATP, we can keep going. It's all about how much oxygen can we supply, and that's going to be determined by our fitness levels. And that's really all there is to know about the aerobic system. There's much more detail, I'm sure, of course, but we're going to keep it very simple. So here's a chart that you'll see, I think, in your NASM book, or this one's actually from the American College of Sports Medicine. I actually think it's in both. Just kind of an overview of our energy systems. So we have the ATP system for strength power, and power lift, high jumps, javelin throw, golf swing, anything fast, pitches. And as you can see, it's 0 to 4 seconds. The ATP and the phosphocreatine system, which is anywhere from 0 to 10 seconds. And then your ATP, phosphocreatine, and well, they're putting that, that's going to make you a little bit confused. But basically, let's call this one just the anaerobic glycolysis. And that is the 0, they say 1.5, but it's really 3 minutes. Don't let that confuse you. Different sources will always give you different exact times on these energy systems. Just for our purposes, we're going to say up to 3 minutes. And then we have the oxidative aerobic endurance energy system, which is anything above 3 minutes. All right? So that chart is in your book. You're going to definitely want to know that for your midterm and probably even your drill or quiz this week. So bring it all together, and I'm actually probably going to do this in class, but what I was going to show you is that essentially your fiber type that you're calling upon really determines which energy system you're in, if that makes any sense, right? So since they're both determined on intensity level, if you are in the aerobic zone, you're having to go for long endurance, long duration, low intensity, you're going to be calling upon your type 1 muscle fibers, your aerobic muscle fibers. If you're doing a CrossFit or a boot camp class, you're predominantly recruiting your type 2A muscle fibers, so you're predominantly going to probably be in anaerobic glycolysis, recreating ATP. That's why you have those rest periods to recreate ATP between your sets or between your stations. Or if you're sprinting, then you're going to be calling upon your type 2B muscle fibers, right? And so you're going to probably be either in your ATP or your ATP PC system. And that's it.